Amy's Choice comes slap bang in the middle of Series 5, a pretty average series in my view, and one where it became pretty obvious Stephen Moffat had a certain way of doing things, and he was going to get right into doing it exactly that way, and thus led to a mostly confusing, overstuffed spectacle first, think later series that more or less defined his entire era that we were going to get over the next 7 years. Now, that's not to say it's bad, but I think it's mostly a forgettable series as a result. But it had its ups and downs, as average is just that, and sort of the combination of up and down. And while the downs were quite low down, you just wait until we get to the Dalek episode of this series, the ups were quite significant as well, of which this episode is usually touted as one. In fact, generally it's usually second to the Van Gogh episode for this series' overall rankings. Which I find interesting, as it's probably the least typical episode for this series of the lot, and that's frankly because I suspect Mr. Moffat had not as much to do with it as he did with everything else. A few suggestions here and there, starting out from the original brief, but overall I think it was left as writer Simon Nye, an experienced writer who created the 90s sitcom Men Behaving Badly, amongst other things, to create the tapestry of the story himself, and thus it was able to focus on the usually ignored things like character and ideas, rather than explosions and browser history jokes. So yes, this is an episode of which I'll mostly speak positively. It's not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but this is a bit of a breath of fresh air that makes good use of its characters and its format in a way New Who as a whole, never mind the Moffat era, does not commonly produce. The most important thing this episode does right, though, is in using the talents of one Mr. Matthew Robert Smith. I have several times before spoken highly of his talents, and bemoaned how frequently they were wasted on the silly flapping hand comedy that Moffat lumbered him with throughout much of that era, whereas his real strengths are in the subtleties of treading the line between light and dark. This episode does an absolutely stellar job of putting that line down on the page for Smith to walk, and he does brilliantly. I'd argue this is the point where he hit a stride with the performance, and the strength of it here really showcases how good he could be when he was given the right material. While in some episodes he could be good when he needed to be dark, but that was lost when the tone changed, usually abruptly and unsuccessfully, in this episode he managed to keep the lighter moments more grounded and, for a lack of a better word, human. It makes the contrast between the two far less jarring, and it means we can get the sense that the subtleties of the darker side are always there beneath the surface. I'll get to all of this and why it works on the page as well, but I think this is one of Smith's best performances and a sign of how well his talents could be used if they were used well, which often they were not, thanks to Moffat. Perhaps it sounds like this is damning with faint praise, but it is so refreshing to have an episode that makes good use of its star through playing to his talents and avoiding jarring mismatches, just as it is refreshing to have a lower-key episode, one focused on the people we are watching, their motivations and journey, and have the moments of the episode away from the main plot be focused on them and their interactions, rather than, say, skydiving with the TARDIS. What I'm trying to say is this is a very un-Moffat-y Moffat-era episode, relatively speaking anyway, and I'm slightly embarrassed of how much I have to emphasise it as a massive improvement over the usual fare. Which leads to the inevitable fall that I have it in for Moffat, and I promise I don't, mostly. I just find him a very frustrating writer much of the time, and, well, I think this episode is a good sign of what his approach could have been like, only with those frustrating edges that he never tried to learn from and change stripped away. So anyway, that's enough waffling, let's get to the actual episode itself, mostly because I'd quite like this review to be a bit shorter than 45 minutes in contrast to the last one I did. Maybe one day I'll surprise you all and finish with the production, but not today, as we're starting with it as always. This episode was directed by Catherine Morshead, who directed 2 episodes in Series 5 as her only work in Doctor Who. This episode, obviously, and The Lodger. To be honest, if I was promised sci-fi action-adventure, and I ended up having to work with James Corden, I'd probably not come back to the show either. Anyway, her job here is mostly good. It's not flawless for a few reasons I'll get to in a moment. But I think the best thing she could have done for this episode is to make it feel as unnerving as possible, to really hammer home that this is a situation where everything is going wrong and nothing can be trusted, and she does a magnificent job with that. I particularly like a shot early on in the episode where the main trio are beginning to realise things are a bit fucked up, and it shows that by the camera constantly rotating around them, which I think does a really good job of creating the required atmosphere and tension. I also like how she shoots, and in particular how she edits the scenes with the Dream Lord. It kind of hammers home the menace and the strangeness and the otherworldliness of it. It's not just he's a powerful villain, but also one that we don't really understand, and it goes for his abilities and powers as well. But she's also happy not just to be a one-trick pony. She goes to the beauty shops of the village that show why it might be somewhere Amy or Rory might want to settle down, or at least Rory. We'll get to that. It helps here that was a good location scouting, of course, with a village you won't be entirely surprised to learn is in South Wales. But in this case, it's actually only about 900 metres away from the border with England. Does that mean a damn thing? No, not really, but occasionally I like to waste your time with useless factoids. Where Morshead does less well is with the staging of the piece. Now, she is being a bit hampered by the script here, as I'm struggling to think of a way you could make shambling old people really threatening. But yeah, the shambling old people look silly and don't contribute to the atmosphere of threat that they should. I mean, the sight of them just shambling through the fields looks ridiculous. There's also the moment when the Doctor and Amy kill themselves in order to end the village dream, which should be a hugely powerful and emotional moment. The problem is it involves them driving a camper van at a moderate speed into a building, which doesn't immediately strike me that would be instantly fatal from the presentation of it, and that robs the scene of some of its power. Again, the script hampered there a bit here, but it should be the emotional crux of the episode, and it still does work. It probably should have just been presented a bit better to avoid looking quite as silly as it does. But overall she does well, and her efforts help elevate this episode. Do you know whose efforts don't help elevate this episode? Yes, I'm afraid it's the regular tradition of the Doctor Who Review Guide where we have a go at Murray Gold. Like Moffat, I don't have it in for Murray Gold, I really don't. There's been a lot he's done that I like, but unfortunately whenever he's forced too far out of his comfort zone, the results are usually unimpressive. Suspense is rarely his forte, and unfortunately he doesn't do well with trying to convey the menace of the Dream Lord, going for his usual one-jarring chord approach that was a favourite of his, especially around this point. And the opening scene practically required a "Hello children, let's start reading today's story" with how ridiculous the music sounded. It's annoying because a more subtle and haunting score was really called for here, and he's just not really capable of that. And I think any kind of reliance on one composer is always going to bring up these kind of problems. But I've spoken about this many times before, and no doubt will do many times again, so perhaps let's not dwell on it. Anyway, let's move on to the script. As I said, it's written by Simon Nye, a well-known and established writer who had done quite a bit of work for TV over the years. Now, you may be remembering from In the Forest of the Night, where Frank Cottrell Boyce was similarly a well-established writer. Well, there are two major differences. Firstly, Nye had actually done some writing for TV within a decade of doing this Doctor Who episode. And secondly, and perhaps more importantly, this concept was not total and utter shit. You kind of see where that helped. This was something Moffat occasionally liked to do. Richard Curtis wrote the Van Gogh episode only a few weeks later, of course. But here I think it has paid off, as clearly Moffat has, for once, not had to stick his fingers inside the script to make it work as he obviously had to do for many times throughout his era. I don't think he was entirely uninvolved, but certainly I think this is Nye's piece and he does a good job with it. Not perfect, but he takes this concept and uses it to its full potential. I think he deserves praise, if nothing else, for avoiding the temptation of going balls to the wall with this in typical Moffat spectacle style. He does what is necessary to make it work, keep it a tight character piece, focusing on the emotions behind those characters and the menace of the villain who's put them in this situation. I don't know what else you can say about the episode, it never loses that focus. Its greatest strength is its laser-tight focus on what matters, and not allowing it to be distracted by irrelevant tush. Like usually in the Moffat era. Okay, fine, I'll stop that for now. Let's start with our main character, and I talked about Smith at the start to highlight what I mean, to say how much of a breath of fresh air this episode can feel like, so I won't repeat myself too much, but yes, his performance is excellent. As for what's on the page, I will always maintain, you'll hear this in more or less every review of his era, that his strengths were just not played to, and the characterisation of the 11th Doctor just came out confused. Now, to be fair, it is asserted that this was BBC executives getting cold feet at the idea of trying something different after Tennant had been such a success, and they wanted the same style of humour regardless of whether it fit or not, and this hampered the ability for them to develop the characterisation that fit they were going for and Smith's performance. The hand-flapping, quirky comedy about how he doesn't understand normal things was no doubt a result of this, and it got very tired very quickly. This episode does use that as its basis, because that was what had been established, but it does so differently than usual. It uses the quirkiness thing as a means of exploring the character. It's based on his interpretation of the future Amy and Rory's married life, and the fact he's clearly uncomfortable with them moving on in such a way as to create the banter out of natural interactions rather than just forcing them in. I can't pretend I still find it particularly endearing, as it's still the one joke of he's a bit odd, but I appreciate how much better it is being handled, particularly as the transition between humorous and seriousness is all the more smooth and natural as a result. The Doctor be doing his best to deal with a stunned, grief-stricken Amy as Rory is killed, leads on naturally from that. It's a situation he was uncomfortable with, but was happy for them in, suddenly turning into a nightmare he has no idea how to deal with, and that builds on the same ideas, of the Doctor being unfamiliar but dealing with the consequences of his companion's normal life. While this episode does have some tonal issues we will get to in due course, I do appreciate how it manages to separate the two parts of the Doctor's character very well. Too often a serious moment will be interrupted by a shit joke, and we don't get that here. When the TARDIS is losing control around the cold star and his frustration is getting the better of him, we don't immediately go back to the goofiness. The bubbling anger at his lack of control over the situation he's clearly repressing is instead presented centre stage, and Smith does a fantastic job of making sure it's covered up. Likewise, when the Dream Lord reveals himself, the witty comments are kept to the Dream Lord himself, while the Doctor treats the situation deadly seriously. It means the Dream Lord's in-jokes about the purple space dog, haha, we remember K9, can come across as a mean-spirited jab from the villain trying to get under his skin, and the Doctor stands there grimly without also falling into a goofy joke himself, but means the audience gets the point just as much as the characters do. As for the Doctor's darker side, well, I think it's a side of the 11th Doctor's character that was always done better, and here it probably is its best. We see the Doctor's resentment and his own character failings, his own jealousy and pride, and certainly see that when he is put in the firing line, when he is unable to just waggle the sonic screwdriver and save the day, this bubbles up in him. But it's written to be subtle and low-key, and Smith plays the line effortlessly, so we can see it build up over the course of the episode, to the point where his final confession of the darkness that fed the Dream Lord is also believable, but not to the point where it becomes over the top or even particularly explicit. I also like that the Doctor throughout the episode is playing catch-up. He's in a situation he can't control, and it feeds into his frustration, but in the end he does win. While it's Amy's emotions that get them out of the village, it's his realisation that he's being played with that gets them out of the Cold Star. The Dream Lord didn't have him beaten, he got the last laugh, and that's what I like. The Doctor was challenged, but not broken. Of course, the darkness within the Doctor is a topic that has been broached many times in the series, and much of it is left unsaid, which is good, because the power of it is the imagination, of having to think for ourselves what the Doctor is repressing, events or emotions or whatever, especially with the Time Worm providing a useful gap to plug all that into throughout New Who. It's often been theorised that the Dream Lord is the same as the Valeyard, and I think that's only half true. I don't think they're the same being, mostly because the Dream Lord isn't a being. This episode makes it very clear, it's just a manifestation brought on by the psychic pollen, while the Valeyard kind of has to be real, given his extended interactions with other characters other than the Doctor. But they come from the same place, manifested from that repressed darkness, manifested from what the Doctor hates about himself and what he tries to keep buried, and it's probably part of why his control wavers throughout this episode. He's trying to prevent something coming up he wants buried deep down. This, I think, is often forgotten when the Valeyard is brought up, that he's not just a Doctor, but evil. He's everything the Doctor fears and hates about himself. The Valeyard, and by extension the Dream Lord here, is not just another villain. It's the Doctor looking in the mirror and not liking what he sees. But I am planning to do a review of the Trial of the Time Lord later this year, so we'll get to the Valeyard then. For this episode, it's the Dream Lord that is relevant, and first of all the performance, and man what a performance by Toby Jones. Now, obviously you all know who Jones is, so I won't give you the rundown, but his performance is absolutely cracking. It's a difficult line he has to walk, being menacing and threatening, but without going over the top, keeping it low-key and eye-to-eye with the Doctor, while also being an effective mirror of him. Jones does that masterfully, keeping that playful manipulation, like he's enjoying tormenting the Doctor, yet even when he's cracking jokes and playing around as a butcher, we're allowed to see him as the real deal. As for what's on the page, well, the Dream Lord has to be an effective mirror to the Doctor, but also an effective villain in his own right. He certainly pulls off the latter, really very menacing and feels like the real deal for just a few choice words, and Jones' performance obviously helps, but the words are very much on the page. He feels like a true villain, one in it just for the love of the game and nothing else, and the first sense of enjoyment he's getting from torturing the TARDIS crew really comes across this way. But it's not a cartoon villain either. There are shades to him that leave the viewer guessing. As for his mirroring of the Doctor, well, I do have to applaud the episode for how all of the above feels like it's just a twisting of what the Doctor usually is. His genuine attempts at friendship and companionship are mirrored by the manipulation. His interest in exploring and discovering has been replaced by hostility, the desire to control and all of that. And the Doctor's occasional darker moments that are more defined by his control of them become more dominating. It does work remarkably well, but only as a subtle thing. Again, one of this episode's strengths in that it doesn't feel the need to shout anything at the audience. They're allowed to work all that out for themselves, right up until the end when the Doctor inevitably exposits it all, but by that point it's fine. That's just, it's the end of the episode stuff. Although, I could have maybe done without the "this is someone we've met before" teasing that ended up going nowhere. That, I suspect, might have been more Moffat addition, but nevertheless. Anyway, as this is a character-focused piece, the only other characters are important than the companions, and I can't pretend I'm a particularly huge fan of Amy and Rory as characters overall. While I do prefer them to Clara, I prefer anaesthetic-free nerve surgery to Clara most of the time, so that doesn't say very much, and generally I have to admit I find Amy a bit blinkered and obnoxious and Rory a bit of a wet blanket. I do, however, think both actors do deserve praise for how they can't handle the characters much of the time, especially when they're given good material, which is usually when the characters themselves are at their most compelling, and this is a very good example of when that could happen. Obviously the title is Amy's choice, who indicates whose choice it is. You're glad I made to tell you these things. The setup of the episode is simple. The Doctor wants to believe the status quo time travel scenario is a real one, because that's where he's comfortable in what's happening and where he knows what's going on, and where Amy and indeed Rory are in the roles he wants them for them, travelling with him as companions always have. Rory wants to believe the future scenario is real, because there he's married to Amy, with a child on the way, living a happy normal life with the person he loves. And therefore it's up to Amy to choose which she prefers. Now, on the surface, this seems like another Amy treats Rory like shit while preferring the Doctor episode, but it's different because it's framed to see that while she is genuinely torn, it's not because she doubts her feelings for Rory or is actually in love with the Doctor or anything, minus a few lines here and there which indicate that she's probably a bit hot for the Doctor's bud, which I could have done without, but that's minor compared to how she basically attempts to cheat on Rory when Moffat is writing her. It is a genuine conflict for her because she wants both. She wants the life with a doctor, the excitement and all that, but her commitment to Rory means that a simpler life is something she perhaps is now only realising she wants to. Again, I think it's framed very well because it's not choosing the person, it's choosing the life, because she already has chosen Rory. And I think the Dream Lord, deliberately in the script of course, has her wrong. He's trying to manipulate the norm, but not realising the person in this trio most sure that Amy is certain in her commitment to Rory is Amy herself. There's a great scene quite partway through the episode where we briefly stop for an interaction between Amy and Rory, where he's obviously a tad insecure about it all, which is a bit of an understatement, and voices his frustration and resentment at the Doctor essentially taking her from him, and her telling him to essentially shut up and grow a pair, but with a great line.
You ran off with another man?
Not in that way.
It was the night before our wedding.
We're in a time machine. It could be the night before our wedding for as long as we want.
I think that's her saying to him in her own way, as she's clearly not able to come out and just say it, but this changes nothing for her feelings towards him. It's just opportunities she can't give up to have this life. And before we continue, marvel that this is an episode of New Who, and I am talking about them taking a moment to have a short scene developing character. Perhaps it is damning with faint praise, but using the running time to actually do something worthwhile instead of meaningless spectacle is such an absolute refreshing change of pace with New Who that is probably why I'm so inclined to give this episode slag. Of course, I also like that this is Rory's death in the future scenario that pushes Amy to choose one over the other. With him in both there was a choice, but without him there was no choice at all. Oh, this is a really great scene, by the way, in both writing and directing. It's played low-key, no over-the-top theatrics, just Amy's grief manifesting in disbelief, then barely concealed rage, and the Doctor stunned by the situation and being yanked out of his control so suddenly. But yeah, this is a really effective scene revealing Amy's true feelings here. What she has repressed previously in the episode comes out in full force. Again, I'd have preferred if death wasn't driving a camper van at a house at speed that might cause the airbags to go off, but never mind. And as for Rory, well, I think this is more a case of examining his relationship with Amy rather than him himself. After all, this is only really his second episode where he's particularly prominent, apart from the introductory one for this series. But I think it does show his wants, that in the end, travelling with the Doctor is mostly a thing he does because Amy wants to, and he does that for her, but mostly he just wants the life with her, and it does show he's sincere in that belief, and he's sincere in his feelings, and it shows us that overall, he's a good person and someone who is right for Amy, which I think is important to establish given that, well, everything Moffat had written about their relationship previously. Anyway, moving on. So we go from the characters to the plots, and for reasons I will get to shortly, this doesn't matter as much in this episode, but there are some things worth talking about. Obviously, looking at the two scenarios we're initially presented with, it's obvious which is the real one. The status quo of the series is going to stay. We're obviously not going to jump ahead in time to a pregnant Amy living with Rory away from the Doctor. Obviously, that reset button is going to be used very liberally, and this was always going to be the problem with doing an episode like this. Unless you make both choices equally plausible, but then the character stuff will be far more limited, as the whole point of the future is to demonstrate the possibilities and therefore be a temptation. The episode does well with this, and therefore making sure that within the context of the episode, it doesn't try to present the future scenario as less plausible until it needs to. While the audience knows this isn't real, there's nothing to suggest to our characters that's the case, and that's what helps it to be believable. We know it's not real, but the characters don't. And of course, that's what makes Rory's death all the more powerful a moment. Again, we know he's not dying here, something I sadly can't say for future episodes, but that's a story for another day, but Amy doesn't, and that's why it works. And then, of course, it turns out that the normal scenario is bullshit as well, which is perhaps a slightly obvious twist, but again, I think the options were somewhat limited, and because it's something I'll discuss momentarily, it was probably for the best. So overall, while this is not a plot episode, it is a character one, I think it does well with the plot it has. The plot is in service of the character, and that's definitely on display, but again, I think it does well enough. Which leads me into a point that you're kind of playing on easy mode whenever you have an episode based around dreams or alternate realities or illusions or whatever, because it means you don't have to make things internally consistent or give the elements within them backing in reality or anything like that, because it's a dream, it's not real. I mean, obviously none of it's real, it's a television show, but within the show it's not real. For instance, I'm no scientist, but my bullshitometer is recording quite high on the scale when presented with a cold sun, which burns cold, and perhaps it shows my low tolerance for New Who's bullshit, as I would have taken it entirely at face value and penalised the episode for it. But I don't need to, because it's not real, it's just a dream, and indeed the very bullshitness of this is what alerts the Doctor that both realities are fake. In the future scenario, the villains are nonsense. Generic monsters with no motivations, whose backstory makes no sense and plan makes even less. First a small village in South Wales, then the world. But again, they're not real. It doesn't matter for the overall story because you can, and indeed no doubt supposed to, just write it off as an inconsistency in the world the Dream Lord has created, rather than an inconsistency with the story itself. As I said, it's playing on easy mode. It's where you don't have to worry about stuff like that, and indeed if you did, it would probably be more of a negative than a positive. If you did spend ages developing the motivations of these monsters, what would it add? They're not real. The motivations wouldn't be real, it would just be spending precious time in this oh-so-short 45 minutes, developing things that don't need to be developed. It therefore creates this very odd setup, which sounds like it shouldn't work, but it does complement the story. Once again, the plot is there to complement the character stuff, not the other way around. So again, the character stuff is effective because the plot just does what it needs to, and the whole fact is the dream is kind of what is enabling that. So no, that's not a problem. There are, however, actual problems, which I will go through now. There aren't too many, but are important to mention. I think it's a sign of however much the episode tries to escape from the usual Moffat-era fare, there's some things it just can't quite manage to avoid. The dialogue, for instance, is not great throughout most of it. It's the usual Moffat quirkiness, which sounds unnatural at best, knuckly cringe-inducing at worst. But I mentioned this in pretty much every review for an episode in this era, so I won't dwell on that. There are also some plot elements that don't really work, as I mentioned in the directing bit. The shambling old people with monsters inside them was just guaranteed to look silly. I think there were probably better options there. But again, it's not quite as important as the tonal problems and the pacing issues will actually do contribute to the overall totality of the episode. They go hand in hand. The episode's tone, it feels inconsistent. Sometimes it's deadly serious and it's usually very effective when it does that, and then sometimes it falls into lazy comedy when it's rather less effective. It works a bit better at the start before the main drama begins and it's entirely character interaction based, but once it's underway it just becomes tiring and distracting. Rory likes the old people was never really a joke to begin with, and when they're in a desperate chase for their lives of Rory trying to protect his only true love, repeating it again is just distracting and jarring. The odd comment here and there, based in character interaction, that's fine for an odd joke. The second comments by the Dream Lord are a good example of where this does work, but it suffers from that age-old Moffat-era problem of not trusting the audience to engage in the drama. So I needed to keep the attention of these stupid drooling sheep by jangling some keys in front of them, either through mindless spectacle, thankfully avoiding this episode, or through lame jokes, which sadly is not. And I think that is just completely the wrong attitude to take towards your audience. As for the pacing, it feels a bit stop-start. Admittedly, this may have been harder to avoid, given that these are two entirely different scenarios being presented, but it still feels jarring a lot of the time, particularly given some of the choices made don't help this. Like, did we really need the Doctor rescuing people in the village? Especially as, none of them are real. I get we needed a camper van for the world's least fatal crash, but I think there were better things to achieve the ultimate outcome. But the point is, it's just an unnecessary scene of quite fast-paced moments. I mean, I wouldn't quite call it action, but you know what I mean. It's more fast-paced and frantic than the slower moments are the more effective. And that's just the stuff in this future scenario. I don't mind what's happening in the other one. I feel like in this case, maybe it was just one more go-over to remove the irrelevancies and focus more to present a more coherent piece. Overall, though, I think this episode is very effective. It's a slow, thoughtful character piece that makes the story about the main characters, their relationships, interactions, emotions, and how they interact with the story as a whole, and it makes it feel very focused, which is a great strength. While I think it could have been improved by a bit more focus, this is overall a piece that transcends New Who's typical way of doing things, and tries to simply focus on using the setup and ideas it has to tell its story and develop its characters. And while you have to appreciate that even more, knowing the alternative was TARDIS skydiving. And again, I think it brings out the best in the creative people. Matt Smith is able to give that excellent performance because he's given the materials that plays to his strengths, to his interpretation of the character, and doesn't force him into a box he doesn't want to go into. Again, I know this whole review has just been me harping on the Moffat era as a whole, and I don't necessarily have it in for Moffat, but I think this is a sign of what it probably should have been overall. More of a playing to the strengths of not just the actors, but also Doctor Who as a whole, and avoiding falling into those same traps. Final score for this episode is 8 out of 10. Now bear in mind this is a measure of how it compares to the rest of New Who and nothing else. But it compares very well. It has a smart idea, it uses it in a very effective way, it's thoughtful with the characters and gives their motivations and actions complexity, and uses most of its premise to give us a truly effective villain, and a look into the soul of our main character, who in some ways remains as mysterious as he was in 1963, just by showing us there is much beneath the surface that the audience doesn't see. It's not perfect, but it is engaging, it is interesting, and it makes the most of the talents of the people involved. It ends up being a very good episode, especially by the standards of New Who.